It was deep into the night, and the dense woods were cloaked in shadows, barely pierced by occasional moonlight filtering through the thick canopy above. A figure moved stealthily through the underbrush, his face obscured by darkness. His eyes, cold and calculating, darted around nervously as he clutched a tattered sack tightly in his left hand. Within the confines of the sack, something squirmed and hissed, but the man paid it no heed. He had come here with a purpose, driven by a sinister intent that gnawed at his conscience. Finding a secluded spot beneath the looming trees, the man abruptly halted and with a callous gesture, emptied the contents of the sack onto the damp forest floor. A feeble struggle ensued as he callously kicked a sack under a low bush, where it would likely remain unseen and forgotten. For him, there was no longer any place for whatever had been in that sack back at his home. He presumed no one would ever stumble upon his secret act of abandonment. However, fate had other plans. Within mere hours of his departure, another presence wandered into this remote part of the woods. Chris, an avid cyclist who relished the solitude and beauty of sunrise rides, was following his usual morning routine. Pedaling along the familiar trails, lost in the serenity of the woods, he failed to notice a gnarled branch lying across his path until it was too late. The impact sent him flying over the handlebars, leaving him winded but mercifully unharmed save for a few minor scrapes. Checking his bike and finding it still operational, he was preparing to continue his ride when a troubling sound reached his ears. At first, it resembled the cry of an infant in distress, echoing faintly through the trees. Chris paused, listening intently. The sound was too shrill, too erratic to be human. It was an animal, undoubtedly in distress. Setting his bike down carefully, he veered off the trail and ventured deeper into the woods, marking his path mentally to avoid getting lost. Drawing closer, the source of the distress became evident. Nestled amidst a clump of shrubbery was a weather-beaten canvas sack, its frayed edges secured with a makeshift wire tie. Chris's heart raced as he approached cautiously, unsure of what he might find inside. The sack twitched and writhed as whatever creature trapped within struggled desperately to break free, its hisses and feeble protests barely muffled by the coarse fabric. Summoning his courage, Chris gingerly lifted the sack from its hiding place and set about unraveling the knot that bound it shut. With each tug, the creature's frantic struggles intensified, its unseen form a blur of frenzied motion. Finally, the knot gave way, and Chris peered inside, bracing himself for whatever awaited. To his astonishment and horror, nestled within the confines of the sack was a tiny kitten, barely more than a few months old. Its fur, once sleek and black, now hung in matted tufts, and a distinctive white heart adorned its chest. The kitten, emaciated and weak, bore testament to days spent without nourishment or care. Its eyes, wide with fear and exhaustion, met Chris's gaze with a mixture of desperation and resignation. Moved by compassion, Chris fetched his water bottle and carefully poured some water into a hollowed piece of bark, creating a makeshift bowl. The kitten, parched and trembling, lapped up the water eagerly, pausing only to catch its breath before drinking again. Slowly, tenderly, Chris reached out, his hand trembling slightly as he sought to comfort the frightened creature. Instinctively, the kitten recoiled, its ears flattened against its skull as it attempted a feeble hiss, followed by a plaintive wail of distress. In that moment, amid the quiet solitude of the forest, Chris made a silent vow. He would not leave this helpless creature to fend for itself. With gentle persistence and a heart brimming with resolve, he would ensure that this tiny, forsaken soul would find safety, nourishment, and the care it so desperately needed. At that pivotal moment, Chris realized the kitten's plight was more dire than he initially thought. Beyond its thirst and hunger, the tiny creature was also suffering from serious injuries. With urgency guiding his actions, Chris knew his immediate priority was to get the kitten to a veterinarian as swiftly as possible. Yet, he was deep in the woods, miles away from any vet, and his only mode of transport was a bicycle. It was far from ideal, but he had to make do with what he had. Thinking fast, Chris fashioned a makeshift sling from his bandana, gently securing it around the kitten's fragile body before carefully placing it into his backpack. Setting off briskly towards where he had left his bicycle, he moved with purpose. Once reunited with his bike, Chris veered off the trail and sped towards the main road, pedaling as if racing against time itself. 90 tense minutes later, Chris skidded to a halt in front of the local vet's office, rushing inside without even pausing to remove his backpack. The receptionist eyed him with curiosity, but Chris, breathless yet determined, explained the urgency of the situation, a critically injured kitten needing immediate attention. The vet appeared just as Chris was extracting the kitten from his backpack. One look at the distressed animal and the vet swiftly ushered Chris into the examination room. On the table, the kitten cowered in pain, its ears flattened against its head in a gesture of suffering. With utmost care, the vet gently lifted the kitten, examining it closely from every angle. The kitten attempted to hiss again, a feeble attempt amidst its evident agony. The vet's diagnosis was grim yet hopeful. The kitten showed signs of internal injuries, potentially treatable, but not without risks. Most concerning was the possibility of spinal damage, which could prove fatal. Beyond the physical trauma, the kitten was severely malnourished and dehydrated, indicative of neglect. Seeking answers, the vet inquired if Chris knew the kitten's history or if it had been struck by a vehicle. Chris recounted finding the kitten abandoned in a sack in the woods, clueless about its origins or how it had come to be in such a dire state. A somber realization dawned: the kitten had been callously discarded, left to fend for itself. Without an owner, its future hung in the balance. Concerned but resolute, Chris made a decision. He would cover the veterinary expenses himself. 30 agonizing minutes later, the vet returned to the examination room with x-rays in hand. Projecting them onto a light box, he meticulously analyzed the images. The findings were disheartening. The kitten had endured more than just a night in a sack. It bore fractured ribs on one side, explaining its struggles to vocalize. Additionally, there was a clean break in the fibula of a front leg, with the knee showing severe trauma. The vet advised Chris to leave the kitten in his care for a few days to ensure it received optimal treatment. Priority 1 was to suture the wounds to prevent further harm. Reluctantly agreeing, Chris gave the kitten a parting glance, promising to return by day's end. In the ensuing days, Chris became a steadfast presence at the vet's office, visiting twice daily. Each day brought incremental improvements for the kitten. While the vet remained cautious, the fractured leg was healing commendably, and signs of internal injury faded. 2 weeks later, on a Thursday afternoon after spending his customary time with the recovering kitten, Chris rejoined the vet in the reception area. Anticipating news, he found the vet waiting. With a hint of optimism, the vet shared that the kitten was nearly fit for release. However, since its origins were unknown, he suggested contacting animal shelters to find a suitable home. Chris chuckled softly, shaking his head. He then asked about the kitten's gender, learning it was a male. Without hesitation, Chris declared the kitten's new name, Huck. Firmly, he asserted that Huck was coming home with him. No shelters, no risks of euthanasia. Huck was to be a permanent member of Chris' family, bound to him for life.